Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the 8th episode of the EU Spectator. I'm thrilled to have you all back with us. Today, we have a special treat for you as we welcome back dear friend and expert in European affairs, Nick Zalewski. Nick has been a guiding voice on many of the critical issues facing the European Union today, and we are excited to dive into another enlightening conversation with him. Welcome back, Nick.
Thank you. And just as a general reminder, as always, please make sure to just subscribe to the YouTube channel and leave any comments regarding your opinion on our views on this video. Go ahead and feel free to express yourself, whether you agree with us, hate everything we say. Go ahead and write it in the comments.
Yeah, exactly. And don't forget to follow us on Facebook and X, formerly Twitter, to stay updated with the latest news, behind the scenes content, and more and more. Stay tuned as we explore the intricate world of European politics and policies with my friend Nick, and you won't want to miss it. So, Nick, in a recent and highly significant development, German Vice Chancellor Robert Habeck has publicly accused Israel of violating international law through its ongoing military offensive in Rafah. This makes the first instance of a senior German politician taking such a definitive and strong stance on the matter. Habeck's comments have sparked a heated debate, not only with Germany, but across the broader European political landscape regarding the legality and morality of Israeli actions in the Gaza Strip. This bold statement from Habeck comes at a particularly sensitive time as the European Union gears up for its parliament elections. The elections, which are just around the corner, have seen various parties and candidates addressing foreign policy issues with heightened intensity, especially the Greens, the Socialists. Habeck's declaration, it's likely to influence the campaign narratives in this moment as candidates and political factions take a stance on this continuous issue, potentially swallowing public opinion and voter behavior. But the EU Parliament elections are a critical juncture for the Union, and foreign policy has become a center theme of our election and our campaign. With Habeck's comments adding fuel to the fire, it's inevitable that Israel's actions and border Middle Eastern policies will become focal points in election debates, in the last election debates. Candidates will need to articulate their position clearly, balancing the EU's strategies, interests with international law and human rights consideration, etc. So this dynamic could significantly shape the electoral landscape and the future direction of EU foreign policy. In light of this development, it's essential to explore how such statements from prominent EU leaders might impact voter statement and the broader political discussion within the European Union. Will Habeck's stance be seen as a call for greater adherence to international law and human rights, or will we polarize voters who hold different views on the Israel-Gaza conflict?
To be brutally honest, this statement is just a distraction for voters in Germany because with the ruling German coalition, they've been failing horribly. And this just seems to be a desperate attempt to distract German voters from the fact that this election has been, the last election in Germany was just horrible. The fact that, yes, we saw the end of the reign of the Christian Democrats under Merkel, since she already decided that she was going to step down and not run. But it just seems like a distraction that they've been horrible with everything, where Germany's become the sick man of Europe, where it's facing enormous economic difficulties, while the traditional European nations that have been struggling for the past 2 decades almost, Portugal, Spain, Italy, Greece, they're doing well economically. You're seeing declining unemployment, you're seeing employment raising, you're seeing the GDP increasing, the purchasing power of consumers improving, and the fall of inflation rates, while Germany just grew to become too dependent on China, and now they don't know what to do. And now it just seems that now the narrative is, well, okay, let's try to please voters who, unfortunately, for many of these voters, they just flat out are anti-Semitic. So it doesn't matter what actions that Hamas takes. It doesn't matter what actions Palestinians take time and time again against Israel. And that's the problem that we need to focus on, because you also have this growing call, besides that Israel shouldn't do what it needs to do to make sure that it can defend itself to fight against Hamas, which people need to remember. In the Hamas charter, it calls for the murder of all Jews. Not just, people try to to say that, oh no, this isn't about attacking Jews. This is about freeing the land from the river to the sea. No, the Hamas charter flat out says that their goal is to wipe out all Jews worldwide. And the sad thing is, with all these European protesters who are so naive, who will repeat a genocidal chant, such as from the river to the sea, which, okay, well, where do the Jews go? If the land's going to be liberated from the river to the sea, they're so naive, they don't even know from what river to what sea. I know I'm being harsh, but I gotta be honest. As an American, I'm sick of people saying, oh, Americans are good with geography, when so many Europeans at these protests, which end up being more pro-Hamas rather than just focusing on civilians, they don't even know what river to what sea themselves. And just the issue, too, is, let's talk about the fact that Palestine has never, ever followed international law. They don't want to follow international law themselves. They don't want to accept coexistence with two nations existing, while many other nations in the region do want that. Jordan, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Egypt, where they're all for two nations existing side by side, and I am too. I don't support any actions by Israel to try to wipe out completely Gaza or the West Bank. But at the same time, what we're seeing is the fact that in Gaza, there's still over 100 people who were kidnapped by Hamas, and we still don't know where they are. That is a war crime. And yet these coward leaders never discuss that when they want to talk about recognizing Palestine. It's like, okay, but what about the fact that Palestine time and time again, under horrific leadership, violates international law constantly? And then we want to sit there and be mad at Israel. One, people just don't look at the facts. The fact that this is one of, first of all, yes, we want to avoid all war, but this is one of the best wars in the fact that we have such a low civilian death toll per fighters. The fact that it's essentially a 1-to-1 ratio for what we know. The issue is that, as you know, most of these numbers are being reported by Hamas. We're going to trust the Gaza Ministry of Health, directed by Hamas. Even the UN finally admitted a few weeks ago that, no, we're going to cut the civilian death toll by 40%. Because Hamas was caught lying, where the numbers made no sense, where it was too much of a linear relationship, which, as you know, it just makes no sense in war. The fact that there would be different periods where we knew that there was no fighting, and all of a sudden it would be a huge rise in the death toll, but not saying, oh yeah, it's because we found more bodies or anything. Nothing like that. But I gotta admit that with X has been so invaluable, and the shameful thing is, so much of our generation lives on social media, but then they refuse to look at X and see the truth.
Yeah, that's true.
Where they would see the truth that different products that we're being told to boycott in the West are being freely sold in Gaza and consumed by Palestinian Muslims. So, I mean, you even had a situation where this innocent Muslim woman with her children went to Starbucks just for an afternoon treat with them, and she's getting screamed at by some bystander that she should be boycotting. One, you'll see other products that we're told, such as Nutella. Oh, Ferrero supports Israel and the war complex.
Come on, yeah.
Really? I mean, we just say that almost about any Western company, but then you look at videos from Gaza and they're showing how Nutella is being sold in Gaza, Coca-Cola is being sold and consumed in Gaza. If there were Starbucks, they would be frequenting the restaurants. And that's where we are, where it just, and that's the problem, that our generation just looks at situations more from emotion than reality, because the fact is, with the reality, if Israel was genocidal, as people try to claim, we would not be seeing the actions that they've taken, such as declaring different areas safe for civilians, where, okay, evacuate to these areas during these specific times. They would just be carpet bombing. And that's the other thing, too, that people inaccurately try to describe Israel as carpet bombing when that's not true. Otherwise, every single building would have been destroyed. And you see different areas, and it's clear that no, different buildings were specifically targeted, where they were Hamas targets. And just the issue is, too, is that that's the biggest thing that we need to talk about, is that we need Palestinians to finally accept defeat, and the fact that no, they're not going to be able to control from the river to the sea. But at the same time, yes, there should be the right to coexistence, which would be another topic for another day that we can get into, is the issue with the Israeli settlers in the West Bank, which, yes, that's not rightful. And that would be almost for another video for us to discuss because of how complicated it is. But the issue is, you then have these terrorist sympathizers in our generation try to say, oh, well, how could Palestinians forgive the Israelis? It's like, and how could the Israelis forgive the Palestinians for trying to wipe them out time and time again? And that's what people don't realize, is that people try to say, oh, well, 1948. Well, what are you talking about? Let's look at the region and the history of how this didn't even start with Palestinians, even with the Roman Empire trying to wipe out Jews from the region. I mean, unfortunately, this has been happening for well over 1,000 years. And when people try to reference a certain time to make it look good and just say, oh, the Israelis are just warmongers, no, the reality is that Palestinians have never accepted the idea of having a large Jewish population in the region. If we look at the history, there's always been an attempt to try to restrict the Jewish population in Israel and the historic land where that's important for the Israelis. And it's like, okay, well, where do they go back to? And the other thing, real quick, that people don't discuss too is the fact that we always talk about Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jews, but we don't talk about the Mizrahi, where they're the largest group of Jews in Israel. And what people don't realize about that group is those families never left the MENA region. They always say they never temporarily went to Europe or outside the MENA region at all. And what people don't realize is that that's the largest group. So but that's the issue too, is that we try to draw this bizarre racial distinction, which you'll see different people who know the history flat out say, but you can't, because you have Palestinians and Israelis who are lighter and then darker. That's how the Middle East is. There is no perfect person to use as, oh yeah, well, that's a true Middle Eastern, where people try to use these bizarre arguments too, that, oh, well, Israelis are blue-eyed blonde. But at the same time, that's not the reality too either. And I encourage people to watch the Netflix show because it's hysterical. You had an American Jew living in Israel, and the matchmaker flat out told him when he tried to say, oh, well, my preference is blue-eyed blonde. Have you met Jewish girls in the Middle East? They're not blue-eyed blonde. Maybe if they dye their hair. And even then, you have some people who are lighter complexion, just how, as we know, with how it works when people have children and you have the different eye color combinations, hair color, that doesn't make them any more or any less Middle Eastern. And it's really interesting. This one, I can't remember his name right now, who was originally from Syria, who moved to the US because of the civil war. And he'll talk about that all the time when people try to say, oh, well, this person who's Israeli is too light to be Middle Eastern. And he says, really? That looks like your typical uncle who would be walking around a Syrian market. What are you talking about? And that's just what people don't, but unfortunately you have this hateful stereotype of, oh, no, all Israelis are just these Eastern Europeans who moved to the Middle East and took land that wasn't theirs. And, and just the issue that when you look on the discourse, it's just bizarre. So, for example, Tel Aviv, it's a relatively new city that was founded.
True.
And yet, if you look at the argument from the Hamas supporters in our generation, they'll try to use the name in Arabic. Well, okay, but the city never existed. It was desert before the Jews built it. So why are we trying to insist that, oh, well, with the Arabic names? And the complicated thing too, that sadly, okay, in an ideal situation, as people put out there, in an ideal situation, you would have a country with a different name, probably not Palestine or Israel, but where everyone could just live together. But unfortunately, that's a long, distant dream because
yeah, unfortunately, it will
that's
not be
not the goal. The
possible.
goal isn't coexistence in the same nation. I mean, it's horrific seeing on social media the narrative of some Palestinian Muslims trying to say, well, if we're going to have coexistence, the Jews can no longer be Jewish. They have to give up their faith. They can't speak Hebrew. Okay, they're supposed to give up their whole entire cultural identity. I mean, this makes no sense, and it makes no sense. And just that's the unfortunate thing that people don't look at the fact that the problems is so much that with war after war in this region too, unfortunately, we're left with the more extremists,
Yeah,
where the
and unfortunately,
Palestinians who want peace, want coexistence, which, hey, let's stop fighting. Unfortunately,
yeah, and unfortunately
so
for
many
me,
of them have fled, where so many of them have moved to Europe, the US, because they don't want to fight. But then the issue is they leave behind people who are more into the warmongering and just are never going to accept peace like they would.
yeah, and unfortunately for me, this seems like the rise of a very big wave of anti-Semitism. But Nick, considering you have a strong statement on this issue, how do you see this affecting the campaign, the campaign strategies of the major parties in the EU member states, in the rest of campaign for the European Parliament elections?
Honestly, I could see it blowing up more into space. It depends. It depends on how voters are, because right now a lot of voters are concerned about immigration policy, and particularly looking at different recent elections where it's definitely people are realizing that we have to be concerned about people trying to put religion back into politics in Europe. However,
Okay.
it's not necessary. People try to say it's more with the Christians, but if we look at the recent local UK elections, you had a man who won running as an Islamist politician. So we can't try to say that, oh, it's just the Christians who are a threat to democracy in Europe. You also have the threat that you have people slowly campaigning for Sharia law in Europe. And I honestly don't necessarily see this. I don't know. It's hard to say with the statement. It just seems to be more of a distraction where he's trying to distract Germans from the fact that the ruling coalition has failed so miserably.
Okay.
That Germany is stagnating big time, and there's no clear deadline for when this could end, where it just seems like the German situation slowly getting worse and worse. And I just don't think voters are necessarily going to pay as much attention to this. Instead, they're going to look at recent incidences, such as, for example, in France, where 4 people were murdered by an immigrant who should have been deported back in 2022. He got the order to leave in 2022. And yet now in 2024, my bad. 4 people are now dead in France because an illegal immigrant who had the asylum claim rejected didn't leave France, and the government did nothing to make sure that people who are not allowed to remain leave. And that's the issue that we're seeing all across Europe.
Okay.
And this definitely is going to dominate the campaign more over Israel and Palestine. A lot of Europeans, such as and I'll compare this to with the United States election. People don't necessarily care about Ukraine and Israel Palestine wars because of how there's so many risks to the quality of life for Europeans and Americans at home. And that's what it seems like a lot of young people even. Where they show different young people in nations like Sweden, in Finland, and I thought even Ireland, they're more likely to vote for the far right because they're disgusted with their politicians
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
who seem to not focus on the future of their own citizens, more focus on trying to help and save the world, where it's almost like we're going back in time. And it's so bizarre because I'll never forget reading in history books where we would make fun in history classes about thought it was a British novel, White Man's Burden, making fun of the idea that it's the white man's role to save the world and saying that's very arrogant and almost, well, not almost, is like a racial supremacist argument. Oh, white people are better than other races, when that's not true. And just all the horrible things that Europe did around the world, where it's like, okay, did we really save the world? But regardless, we're almost seeing where now politicians are trying to return to that, acting as if, oh, well, they could save everybody. The fact that now you're seeing in Ireland how they're setting land aside
Mm-hmm.
to help out all these new arrivals when you have homeless Irish at home. And people in this election are definitely going to look at that. And it's time for European politicians to wake up and realize that it's not that these European voters necessarily are racist. It's the fact that if European politicians do not take care of European citizens, nobody else will. Do we really think that Hamas leaders are going to be concerned for homeless Irish people? No.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the issue that we're seeing in this election, where you're definitely seeing, going to see a lot more people voting for far right parties who probably would have never considered it before in their lives. But if we look back to Germany, because I talk about how, I'm talking about how the leading coalition is currently failing. We got
Okay.
to be fair too, though, and give the blame to Merkel. Merkel was a center-right politician in Germany who failed her people and allowed too many migrants in, who so many, yes, they've done great where they've integrated in life. They're doing their best to learn the German language, respect other people with different beliefs, and they're just chilling, and that's great. But at the same time, Merkel also allowed a violent minority to almost try to establish their own ethnic state in Europe.
Yeah,
And that's
true.
the
And
issue that is going to be taken out this election, that politicians have to say, hey, let's
true, but
create a place where people could immigrate, they could come, but as long as you respect others. But at the same time, you can't carry out a tax
and because
because some people are Christian and you want to establish Sharia law.
yeah, but also because of this, many EU countries are already grappling with high levels of immigration from various global
Yes.
hotspots, and the potential influx of refugees from Gaza adds a new layer of urgency to the situation. But historically, the EU has faced challenges in developing a unified and effective response to the refugees crisis. But I don't know if it works, because the 2015 refugees crisis, driven primarily by the Syrian civil war, exposed deep divisions among member states regarding refugee quotas, border controls, or asylum policies. This division have often been characterized by a clash between humanitarian obligations and national interests, with some countries advocating for open borders. You mentioned Germany, yeah, and others calling for structural immigration control, like the Eastern countries, the Eastern European countries, and
Well, it's because they also realize the fact that with those Eastern European countries, they're still trying to achieve economic convergence with richer
Mhm.
nation states. So at least they're smarter to realize we're not going to prioritize people who are trying to take advantage of the generous government benefits for refugees who
Okay.
ignore the 10 other nations they went through. They could have stayed there and been safe, but instead they wanted to come to Europe to take advantage of the taxpayers here. And you're seeing taxpayers who fall into precarious situations where, say, they lost a job, couldn't find anything else to pay the rent, and now they're homeless. And you have
Mm-hmm.
European politicians ignoring them, saying, oh, well, we have to help refugees from this country. One, okay, but what about the fact that you have people at home who need help? And the fact that Europe has the fact what? The EU population is about 448 million. It
Yeah.
can't withstand the billions living in poor nations. While it could try to do more to help these nations to develop, at the same time, Europe has to be strict with saying, no, you have to also be willing to stay in your home nations and help them develop and demand your own government step up and do their jobs and help those citizens. And
True,
that's
but
what we're definitely seeing in this election, that you're definitely having voters who are sick and tired of seeing their rents increasing tremendously because because that's the other issue too. These European nations want to say, oh, we're open to everyone, but then they do nothing to make sure enough housing is being built. So you're seeing citizens who essentially have seen their rent increase by 50 to 100% within the past 10 years, and yet the salaries aren't increasing to catch up with that.
yeah, but also we have a problem from a politically point of view, because the issue of immigration remains highly contentious with the European Union, and
Yeah.
we know that the far right and populist parties across Europe have capitalized on anti-immigration statements to gain electoral support, and framing refugees as a threat of national security and cultural identity. And the potential arrival from Gaza could further fuel these narratives, leading to increased
Well, rightfully
polarization.
so, because Europe has no place accepting Gaza refugees. Gaza
Yeah.
refugees could go to Egypt and Jordan. Enough's enough. Look at how many European nations are struggling because of how many Ukrainian refugees arrived, which rightfully so, though, because Ukraine's in Europe. When are other nations going to step up and help refugees in neighboring countries? Because
Mm-hmm.
that's the issue. Where's the money in Europe? After a while, there is none. And that's where we're seeing, and whether people are going to try to say I sound far right or not, that's on them. But at the same time, the problem is we're reaching a limit where we're seeing the quality of life for younger Europeans and younger Americans falling tremendously because we're expected to open our pockets to help everyone. But then when it comes to us, oh, well, that's on you. Just take out a loan or something. Sorry, we don't have any help for you. There's no government assistance for you. And you're seeing where a lot of young people might never be able to buy a house. And then what? You're stuck renting and just working forever then, because as you know, the issue with that is we see that in Germany already.
Mm-hmm.
Germany has a similar homeless population per capita to Greece, and yet it's economically better off because why? Less people own their house there, less than 50%. So the problem is you have a lot of older people where, because the German government refuses to increase pension benefits for them, rents are rising too fast and they don't have money. So you have these elderly Germans having to choose between food and rent. And
Mm-hmm.
so many, and as you know, well, okay, you could only live without food for a month. So a moot point trying to pay rent. So it's like shame on the German government for not taking care of them first, rather than saying, oh, well, we have to help people from this country and that country and that country. And your own citizens who dedicated decades of their life helping the welfare state. And that's what a
Mm-hmm.
lot of Europeans are getting tired in this election, saying, well, wait a minute. We did our part to help the welfare state. And now what if we need help? There's no assistance for us, but people who come here and criticize every aspect of our nation too sometimes, because some of these videos are horrific on X that are being published, where you're
Of course.
seeing people who are being completely ungrateful with the housing that's being given to them for free. Oh, this is it. I'll never forget, there was a video in Ireland showing a Middle Eastern family upset at a house when a lot of people are commenting saying, this is your typical middle class Irish home and you're getting it for free. What's there to be upset about when you have people in Ireland waiting for years for housing and they get nothing? They live on the street for years and there's nothing for them.
But you know what is very interesting, because I find something about the international, because you mentioned at the beginning of our conversation the aspects of international law. I find something interesting in the UN Charter. But while I have great respect for the German Vice Chancellor Habeck, I must express my disagreement with his statement accusing Israel of violating international law, because it seems like the German Vice Chancellor has no idea about the international law, and such a stance oversimplifies a deeply complex and multi-phase conflict, and it's essential to. This is for me, as as expert in international relations. It's essential to recognize that Israel actions, often characterized as self-defense measures, are conducted under the continued threats of attacks from terrorist organizations like Hamas, which regularly targets civilian populations. And according to the Article 51 of the UN Charter, every sovereign nation has the right to self-defense against armed attack, which is a critical aspect of Israel's justification for its military operation.
Well, and then the other thing that people don't talk about is the fact that Hamas has fired, at this point, tens of thousands, if not over 100,000 rockets since October. And that's what people don't talk about. This isn't a genocide when the fact that tens of, hundreds of rockets a day are being fired at Israel.
Of course.
Are we really going to go back to look at other genocides when we talk about how the fact that the genocide of Srebrenica in Bosnia was finally recognized?
Yeah.
Hello, it was just taking Muslim men in the village and murdering them. There was no ability to self-defense. It was just lining them all up and killing them all. There was no ability to defend themselves, while Hamas has stolen billions of aid that was supposed to help develop the area for the civilians, but instead Hamas used billions to finance the wealthy lifestyles of those leaders who are cowards and live in Qatar, build hundreds of miles of tunnels underneath, and then also be buying all these missiles to fire at Israel. That's respecting international law. But, and it's like, shame on the German leader. And what about the Syrian president, too, who tried to murder so many different minority groups in his own nation? And still to this day, there's no calls to drag him before the ICC for his war crimes. And that was the other thing, though, that I gotta admit, that it's shameful that we're even trying to compare Netanyahu to Hamas terrorists, and when the ICC is trying to treat them the same, when if Hamas didn't choose to slaughter 1,000 people in one day in Israel, this wouldn't have happened. And the other thing, too, that people don't talk about the fact, too, is that where that attack happened, those were the people who, as we say in English, were the bleeding heart liberals. Where those were the people who were compassionate towards a two-state solution, which I maintain, yes, it should be a two-state solution. But the problem is, when you went into their villages and in some cases killed 25%, 50% of them, do you really think they're going to turn around and say, oh yeah, a two-state solution is definitely possible right away? They're pissed and they're thinking about defending their own nation. And that's the issue, that it's okay. Is Palestine going to step up when it wants international recognition and say, yes, we want to be recognized officially as a state, but we're also going to turn around and dedicate ourselves to coexistence and respecting international law? Or are they simply going to abuse this new state status to keep on attacking Israel? Yeah, and that's the issue.
Yeah, but you know what? It's funny but tragic at the same time. It's that also the International Court in Hague has no idea about the international law, because and about the international humanitarian law, specifically the Geneva Convention, because the Geneva Convention acknowledged that the challenging realities of warfare, and while it mandates the protection of civilian lives and property, it also recognized that civilian causalities to tragic, of course, can occur in the course of legitimate
But that's also
military
the thing, though. The
actions.
Geneva Convention, which all these Hamas
Yeah,
supporters in Europe and the US don't want to acknowledge, is the fact that the Geneva Convention, while it says you should not attack hospitals, that goes out the window when it's being used as terrorist bases, which is
yeah,
unfortunately
yeah,
the case in Gaza.
and
Hamas has turned every single hospital into a little base for themselves to do terrorist attacks, so then they can try to turn around and say, oh, well, Israel's attacking hospitals. Yeah, because you have Hamas fighters in there.
yeah,
Why are
and
fighters fighting out of a hospital? They're cowards.
yeah,
But
and
this is the problem,
unfortunately,
though. This is the typical fighting strategy of Gaza for 80 years now. They always strike first and start a war, and then when they start losing, they use their civilians as shields. And if anyone wants to try to say this, look into more of the history of martyrs in Gaza, where unfortunately you have the mother of martyrs, which
mhm,
is a former politician, the most famous female now deceased, who is a member of the parliament, who gloated how she would have sacrificed every single child and grandchild and just have them killed for the sake of the fight. And it's like,
yeah,
why would you purposely put your children and grandchildren in the line of fire? And that's the issue, though, that this is
yeah,
constantly what Hamas does,
and
and
it's
all, but
also
not just Hamas, where this has gone on for decades, where this is the Gaza fighting style of putting civilians in the line of fire, so then they can turn around and say, "Oh, gee, some civilians died. Look at that. Look at Israel attacking civilians."
yeah, I totally agree with you, but it is also important to consider the broader context of international law and state practice, because the international community often holds a double standards
Oh,
when
it's always where it wants to hold one standard to you have to be perfect. You can't make a single error, while
exactly
Hamas could do whatever it wants, and well, we're not going to prosecute them. And the other
because
issue that nobody wants to talk about with the ICC is, which I did take an international law course, and it was interesting because the professor flat off the basis that international law is incredibly weak because it's only effective if a state subjects itself. And one of the
yeah,
rare instances we actually saw the ICC being useful was the conviction of some war criminals in Serbia, only because Serbia wanted to formalize relationships more with other European nations. If
mhm,
Serbia didn't care to do that,
yeah, and
those war criminals would have been fined in Syria,
yeah,
in Serbia. As
I
long as they
agree.
don't leave Serbia, the ICC has no jurisdiction to actually physically go there and arrest someone, and that's the issue that nobody talks about. So, for example, with this recent ICC ruling, it really means nothing unless Netanyahu were to leave Israel, and
Yeah,
that's
I
the issue
agree.
where
I totally agree. I
it
totally agree
just
with you. And many countries engaged in military operation have caused significant civilian casualties without facing equivalent scrutiny or condemnation, like U.S. in Iraq and Afghanistan. Unfortunately, this selective application of international law undermines its legitimacy and fairness. So,
well,
because
it also definitely limits it when they're trying to attack the only Jewish state in the world.
mhm,
One, you have 57 Islamic nations worldwide, dozens who have committed atrocities against their own people or neighbors, and nothing really gets discussed about that. They don't get dragged before the ICC. It's almost acted as, oh, it is what it is. Sure, they committed all these war crimes, they violated international law, but we have a different standard for them. We're going to
yeah,
only have the standard for Israel. And
mhm, yeah,
but at the
true.
and it's becoming where people are losing faith in the ICC when they are seeing Netanyahu being treated exactly as the same as Hamas.
Yeah, and because I wanted to approach our second issue, our second topic for today, you know that the Hungarian Prime Minister Orban Viktor has announced a significant shift in his country's stance towards NATO. This is a shock for me and for everyone, I think. standing that Hungary seeks to redefine its membership to prevent involvement in military operation beyond the alliance's territory boundaries, and this move has profound implications for NATO's strategic coherence and Hungary's position within the alliance, particularly in the context of ongoing global conflicts and security challenges from Russia. And Orban's proposal underscore his government's increasingly nationalist and isolationist approach to foreign policy and international cooperation, which has been a hallmark of his administration. But since Russia's full-scale invasion in Ukraine in February 2022, Hungary's Hungary's position and Hungary's policy to support Ukraine has faced considerable challenges within the European Union. Hungary's stance has often slowed down EU decision requiring unanimity, including measures to support Kyiv. You know that. And Mr. Orban's government has been consistently skeptical of action that could escalate tension with the Russian Federation, reflecting Hungary's complex historic and economic ties with its eastern neighbor. And this position has not only isolate Hungary within the European Union, but also raise questions about its commitment to collective security principles sharing in NATO. So in light of this development, it will be crucial to hear your insights and your position. And how do you, Nick, how do you see Mr. Orban's stance affecting Hungary's relation with NATO and its strategic position within the alliance?
Not only with Hungary, but this is why Eastern EU member states are not always respected as much as EU member states, is because you constantly see politicians such as not only Orban, but Prime Minister Fico in Slovakia, having this bizarre, it's almost like they're living in the past where they're fantasizing still about the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union failed. It was horrible. These member states of NATO and the EU are becoming richer because they got away and escaped Russia. Enough's enough. I don't understand why there's this so many times this idealization of Russia in these Eastern EU member states and NATO member states sometimes, where you're seeing in Hungary, Slovakia, Bulgaria. These nations are becoming incredibly wealthy because they got away from it, because they joined the EU, because they joined NATO. And it's just so bizarre how Orban just has this, but it goes back to the bizarre comments you see on social media, where because there will be some issues with crime on the subway, you'll have different crazy far-right ex-users show a repost a video of the Moscow subway. Well, look at how nice it looks. See, this is what's stopping you from moving to Moscow. The fact that Putin's a dictator and the fact that Russians have to be scared of the state. That's the benefit that people have living in NATO member states, living in the EU, that Russians don't, and why we've seen millions of educated Russians escaping because they don't support Putin's actions in Ukraine, because it's finally the last move that broke the camel's back, and how they've had enough. They're not going to live in Russia any longer until Putin's out of office. And it's just this bizarre reality where he wants to ignore the other aspects. The fact that 20% of Russians still do not have indoor plumbing. So, I mean, I could not imagine living in a nation like Russia where it gets so incredibly cold in winter and you're having to go outside to use an outhouse. And that's the reality for 1 out of 5 Russians, still to this day. Russia has so much work to do to develop, but people get sucked into Moscow and St. Petersburg. It's like, that's only 2 cities, though. The majority of Russians live outside, and they're leaning and they're leading horrible lives still because the Russian government ignores developing their quality of life.
Mm-hmm.
While Hungary, on the other hand, is seeing a huge rise in the quality of life as a NATO and EU member state. And this leads similar to the discussion about Greece, how Greece has this unshakable relationship with Serbia, and unfortunately, it was even supporting Serbia while it was committing war crimes in the Yugoslavia civil war when Yugoslavia fell apart, where Greece refused to take any military action against them. And that's just, you know, the issue is with Hungary. What does it take, or is it considered acceptable by Orban if Putin says, okay, Hungary is no longer independent? It's once again part of Russia. Is
Okay.
that acceptable to him? Because it's very bizarre. Well, oh, well, European territory hasn't been attacked. Okay, but he's constantly threatening it. Look at this week, how the Russian government published an article talking about changing the boundary of the Baltic Sea by Kaliningrad, trying to grab more sea away from EU and NATO member states.
Okay.
It's one thing to say, okay, we shouldn't add, because I agree. I don't know if it would necessarily be in the best interest to have NATO actively fighting in Ukraine, where leading to a full-out war with Russia. I don't know if that would be to the benefit of Ukraine, which is what we need to always remind too with that. Well, okay, what's benefit to them besides looking at the defense of NATO member states? But he just lives too much in the past and just has these romantic notions towards Russia and towards Putin that are just so bizarre. The time has, it's one thing where we should remember, yes, we could have good relationship with Russia in the future. Look at how much Germany has changed since World War II.
Mm-hmm.
And look at now how it actively fights for peace within Europe. This is why we have the European Union, with European nations finally deciding, no, let's focus on peace, not war. But at the same time, we need to force Russia to change. Because that's the thing, too. I've noticed too many people are too willing to accept Russia right away until it actually shows it's serious about peace. And the fact that it will change. It's not going to be a dictatorship led under Putin, who's just going to invade Ukraine every few years and wants more territory. Because that's the other thing that him and critics of the war get wrong, with the fact that, oh, well, Ukraine should just have peace talks with Russia and should just give up territory. Well, wait a minute. Russia had already tried to annex the Crimea Peninsula back in 2014. Now it's invaded Ukraine once again in 2022. So what? Every 8 years, Ukraine's supposed to allow Russia to take a little more territory away until Ukraine's completely gone? Come on. And the reality of the fact is, I already wrote an article for an online magazine discussing the fact that Russia's also threatening Moldova and Belarus. It's
Yeah.
very clear that Russia wants to go back to the Soviet Union. And I understand that in some Eastern EU member states, there's still frustration, the fact that salaries aren't automatically equal to what they are in Germany. But look at how fast they've grown. The fact that in 2012, or no, in 2004, I believe, oh my God, I can't remember the specific year, but regardless,
I think
in
2004.
Bulgaria, no, I'm just talking about with salaries in Bulgaria. The fact that how quickly they've grown, the fact that within the past 2 decades, the average wage was only €2, oh no, 80 cents an hour. Then it grew to 240. Now it's €8 an hour. And this is all thanks because Bulgaria moved towards the West, became an EU member state. Do people who support Russia and Bulgaria really think wages would have grown this quickly compared to Russia? The fact that in Russia, the minimum wage is still about €200 a month. It's a little higher in Moscow and St. Petersburg, where Russia's minimum wage acknowledges that the cost of living is higher there, but that's nothing. While Bulgaria, you're seeing the wages growing very quickly and throughout Central Europe, Slovakia, Hungary, Poland. Are we really going to try to sit here and say, oh, well, the Soviet Union, it's gone and dead, and thank God, because it was not beneficial to the people who were living in those nations. The
Yeah.
Soviet Union was beneficial to Russia, exploiting the former members of the Soviet Union. And we see that to this day in different nations such as Turkmenistan that really struggles because it was used for agriculture and different things, but other economic sectors were never built up. So the nation still struggles to develop to this day because of that. You still see that in Eastern EU member states that they still are struggling to get past some of their limitations. But
True.
at the same time, they're having wild success in the EU as a part of NATO and as part of the West.
Yeah,
And
yeah. And because you mentioned
yeah,
that, because you mentioned that, and also that Russia needs to develop itself, I like uh, I like to ask you to allow me to present a new project of a friend of mine. This marked a significant milestone of a friend of mine was rich. Vlada Kachurova, it's her name. She finally launched her podcast on immigration titled "Where Are You Now?" And this question, which Vlada and her friends often ask each other over the past 2 years, serves the inspiration behind this project. And the podcast, her podcast, owes much of its existence to the support, assistance, and remarkable faith in Vlada's vision provided by her husband Dima and other friends. And in this podcast, in Where Are You Now, Vlada, along with intriguing and insightful individuals exploring the Russian immigrant experience, delving into topics such as rebuilding one's life, finding meaning, integrating into new societies, seeking external support, and nurturing international resilience. But I'd like to return to our topic, and I'd like to express my thoughts about Orban position. And I think that this stance, Orban stance, also sends a troubling message about Hungary's commitment to collective security.
well, and the issue, the fact that you see the struggles with Moldova, with Transnistria,
Yeah,
where
yeah,
Moldova is stuck, where Russia takes advantage, does whatever it wants, it meddles in that with also with Georgia. And
exactly.
it's just shameful for him to say, well, it's not happening on NATO territory. You know,
Yeah,
I would so love to see Orban's stance if uh a good chunk of Hungary was occupied by Russia and other nations were saying, oh, well, it's not us. It's okay for Russia to
mhm,
just go into any European nation it wants and just freeze their development because they're fighting this civil war essentially where you have parts of the
yeah,
country frozen in time, occupied by Russian troops to the
yeah. But
benefit of no one.
also Orban's announcement has raised concerns about Hungary's broader foreign policy orientation, and it's alignment with other authoritarian regimes. And Orban's government has faced criticism for its close ties with the Russian Federation, with Mr. Putin, and China, and with Mr. Xi, raising questions about its commitment to Western democratic values and Western democratic bloc and principles. By by seeking to limit Hungary's NATO commitment, I I really think that Mr. Orban risks further alienating Western allies and deepening Hungary's isolation within the transatlantic community. And this could have significant diplomatic and strategic consequences for Hungary's standing on the world stage, undermining its ability to influence key decision and shape regional security dynamics. But Nick, I'm very curious about one thing. In the light of the upcoming EU parliamentary election, how do you think Orban stands on NATO and his new foreign policy strategy will influence the campaign in Hungary and the campaign dynamic and voter statement in the country? Do you believe this could strengthen Fidesz position or potentially backfire?
It's hard to say because unfortunately in some of these Eastern EU member states there's still so much love for Russia, even though, as we've discussed, that it makes no sense. The fact that the economic development is because these nations escaped the EU.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we're going to ignore that. I don't know why someone's
sure.
ringing the bell. I'm not expecting anyone. Sorry about that, everyone.
Don't worry.
It's hard to say because I think people are slowly seeing away from. They're slowly seeing through his facade that Orban has constructed in Hungary because people pointed out where this one horrible campaign poster just had horrible placement in Hungary, where it talks about how Fidesz is taking Hungary into the future. And it's placed on a building that is collapsing because it's just falling down. It hasn't been repaired, where it looks like you could just push it and it'll fall. And a lot of Hungarians were laughing, saying, seriously, you put a poster about taking us into the future on a dilapidated building? It's hard to say though. You know, it just seems like unfortunately so many people are stuck in the past where they get angry about the competition under capitalism, but then at the same time don't want to acknowledge the fact that people are living far worse under communism. And the fact that, you know, you just have arrogant people of all different ages. Oh, well, we just have to try it a different way. Well, how about instead we just focus on maybe making adjustments to capitalism rather than overthrowing the system towards a system that has been far worse for some of these nations. And hopefully, I really do hope that Orban loses a bit in this election, but it's hard to say given the priority because I don't think his position is necessarily going to be the top priority. I think you're going to have more people focusing on immigration, where immigration is going to be the top topic. And the reality is that while Orban has a lot of bad takes politically, it still benefits the fact that he's very anti-immigrant, which helps different Hungarians who are concerned that they would be overburdened with trying to help too many refugees, that they'll keep on voting for him unless they see an alternative who might be different on political stances, but not but still not be saying, oh yeah, and we'll also take in all these refugees like Germany did.
Yeah, unfortunately. Yeah. Nick, because we are close to the final of our podcast, I like to say that as we look ahead to the European Union Parliament elections, the issues discussed today will play an essential role in shaping the political landscape and understanding the political landscape of the European Union. I'm glad to have you back in our podcast. And the stance, of course, that's are my final remarks. The stance of leaders like Habeck and Orban reflects broader trends and tensions within the European Union between adherence to international law and national sovereignty, and between collective security commitments and individual member states' interests. Ladies and gentlemen, these dynamics will be critical in determining the future direction of both EU and NATO policies. please stay tuned as we continue to unpack these and other vital issue on future episode of the EU Spectator. Nick, thank you very much for your insights and for your expertise, and I can't wait to see you again in the future episodes of our podcasts.
Yeah, thanks for having me back. And just a quick statement: whether people are going to be happy or disappointed with the EU election results, it's also important to realize that it's only one election and that there's always time
Mhm.
for the better election. But it's definitely important for people to realize that, considering that effectively anyone could start their own political party in the EU, if you're not happy with the options, it's important for the next time to prepare and create a party then that puts forth another option rather than constantly complain and lament that you're stuck with different options that you're not satisfied with either because of their beliefs. Well, become the alternative that you're looking for then rather than complain that it doesn't already exist.
Yeah, so come on, people, vote, just vote.
Exactly. Vote and create your own political parties if you're not happy with the options.
Of course, of course. Thank you very much, Nick, once again.
Thanks for having me. And remember, everyone, subscribe to the YouTube channel, comment whether you agreed or disagreed with us, and your thoughts in general about how international law is constantly ignored and the issue with Orban weakening NATO from the inside out.
Yeah, that's it. Thanks once again.
Thank you.